if this is a 2 kilometer long transect, we'll put a recorder every 500 meters along that transect, and that creates spatial units to work in our transect. So the idea here is to compare our survey data from protocol surveys, which by that we mean like people on the ground, to the recorder data. And so we space out these recorders along the transect, and we have the recorders working from 4 a.m. to 11 a.m. Every day, so that we make sure we don't miss any of the season. And then we have 5 human surveys over the course of the season. So that gives us kind of a comparison for the data. We also looked for nests in these sites to make sure we know where the cuckoos are nesting relative to where the recorders are. And that can give us an indication of, if one recorder picks up way more vocalizations than the other, and we know that the nest was close to that recorder, it kind of gives us a relative idea of what those vocalization rates are. And so this is a map. I really like maps, so you're going to see a few maps from here on out now. But this is a map of the wildlife corridor area, the Borderlands Wildlife Preserve area. So down here in the lower right is the preserve itself, and then this green line is the Forest Service boundary. And since the Forest Service loaned us the recorders, we placed the recorders just above the Forest Service boundary along Stevens Canyon here. So Stevens Canyon kind of comes into the Wildlife Corridor Preserve, and it kind of empties out in that preserve and widens out quite a bit. But up here it's a bit more narrow. Same with Smith Canyon over here. So Stevens Canyon and Smith Canyon. Each of these white dots is one of our recorder locations. And so we went there, we deployed the recorders, and we did some protocol surveys. And the yellow dots are where we detected cuckoos on the protocol surveys. And so we also detected cuckoos in Smith Canyon as well, but we didn't have recorders in there in 2019. So you can see we have a pretty good spread of cuckoos throughout the site. So they're using the upper stretch here and this lower area a little bit, and especially over here in the wildlife preserve on the private land that Borderlands owns. They're actually on that property and using quite a bit of that space. And then a little bit more data. These pink dots represent breeding areas that we were able to confirm, and the circles just represent general territories that we were delineating. So you can see we did have breeding in Smith Canyon on the Borderlands Wildlife Preserve, as well as the upper part of Stevens Canyon. So these are areas that we did not expect to find cuckoos, a couple years ago before this study started. And this is what Stevens Canyon looks like, where we found the nesting cuckoos. Again, it's pretty open. There's some big oak trees. The mesquite aren't that big, but you can just see how green it is. This is mid-monsoon season, and I mean, this is a desert, but it looks pretty green. This looks like New England to me in some ways. This greenery really, this green vegetation helps promote the glut of insects and food availability for cuckoos. And that's what I think brings them to these sites to breed. Even though it's not a really dense woodland, they're able to get enough food in this area during the monsoon season. And this is a juvenile cuckoo that we found in the wildlife preserve. So you can see it doesn't even have its yellow bill yet. That comes in a little bit later. So this bird's probably about maybe a couple weeks out of the nest. So pretty cool to find juveniles in this kind of habitat. You can see here it's in an oak tree. So really exciting. And then moving on to some of our results from the recorder project. So here's a little figure of all of our vocalization data from 5 different sites pooled together. So this isn't just Stevens Canyon. This is 5 different sites that we had. And these survey periods represent 15-day intervals throughout the summer, starting in June all the way into early September. And then you can see we have the different vocalization types here in different colors. So I won't get too much into the weeds here about this data, but you can see there's kind of this like curve going up into the middle of the season, and then it starts to curve back down, except for these coo calls, which the cuckoos are giving in late summer here in really high numbers. And just to explain that real quick, because it is kind of an anomaly, the coo call is given by cuckoos not very often, but when they do give that coo call, they give it all day. So one female might coo for hours and hours and hours which means we're going to just, the number of detections we get is just going to skyrocket if they happen to be near one of the recorders. The other vocalizations they don't give as frequently. Cuckoos are actually pretty quiet birds overall. So that kind of explains that huge spike in the coo calls. But generally, you can see it's kind of just like a curve throughout the season. But the fact that we're picking them up so much at all is just really good data, and really supports the idea that these recorders are powerful tools. And for Stevens Canyon specifically, we actually didn't get a whole lot of recordings, although those coo calls did spike throughout the season, even in late in the season as well. So that's still enough to tell us that, yeah, the cuckoos are here early in the season, and even late in the season, and potentially really late in the season. They might be trying to do another clutch if that female is cooing, advertising for a mate. So really interesting data there. And then comparing the recorder surveys to the protocol surveys. So this is the number of detections over the course of the season for protocol surveys where humans go out and look for cuckoos. And again, it's kind of a curve. You know, it's a lot of detections early in the season and then kind of flattening out towards the end. And it's kind of mirrored by the recorders as well, although it almost looks like it stays even more effective later into the season. So again, this is kind of how we compare back and forth between the two different survey types, which helps validate our hypothesis that these recorders can be effective tools for monitoring cuckoos. And then kind of going back to these maps. So, it's really great that we're finding cuckoos in the Stevens Canyon and Smith Canyon areas around the Borderlands Wildlife Preserve. If anything, it just suggests that this habitat is actually very important for breeding. And kind of zooming out even further to the Patagonia area, you can see that it's part of just a network of areas that we surveyed. And it fits into this hypothesis that cuckoos are using these mountainous areas to breed. So if you think of this kind of being Sonoyta Creek coming down from Sonoyta through Patagonia and down to Patagonia Lake, this is the riparian corridor where we expect to find cuckoos. In these mountains where we never really thought to look at previously, the data that we've been able to collect shows that they're actually using this habitat pretty extensively throughout the mountains and up into the Santa Ritas especially. All of these other drainages are just loaded with cuckoos if you look in the right places. And then going out even further to the region, you can see east of Tucson in the Rincon Mountains and south in the Santa Ritas and Patagonias and into the Atascosas, we're finding cuckoos all over the place. And I've highlighted the riparian areas in blue just to indicate that that's the riparian habitat where we know there are cuckoos, and up in these mountains is where we did not know there were cuckoos. So again, just really fun data to collect. I mean, I can't really complain about my field sites. I get to go all over these mountains and explore looking for cuckoos. But there's still some questions. So, our survey and study area mostly focused on the mountain ranges west of the San Pedro River. We weren't able to get east of the San Pedro River as much as we would have liked to in the last few years. I was hoping to do that this past summer, but COVID kind of got in the way. So, up here on Mount Graham, the Galliero Mountains, the Chiricahua Mountains, around Bisbee and the Mule Mountains, there's still a lot of data to collect, also on the whetstones and the Huachucas. So, although we have a lot of really cool data to indicate that cuckoos are using these upland habitats, there's still more work to be done, and this project isn't fully complete yet. So a couple of just key points to take away from this. We've noticed that yellow-billed cuckoos definitely are using southeastern Arizona upland habitats. And this is really important right now, especially because, the species is still in decline overall. So even though we're finding new populations, we're losing populations in other areas, like in California and Utah and Nevada, where we used to have more cuckoos. So, even though we're finding some more populations down here in Arizona, on the whole, the western range is still contracting. And then critical habitat is being designated right now as we speak. My boss with the Fish and Wildlife Service is working on critical habitat designation. And so this data is really important, especially right now, because this data is being fed in real time back to Fish and Wildlife Service so that they can use this data to inform their management plans. And it's also important to note that, you know, these upland habitats are much different than riparian areas. In some cases, they have different threats and different management practices. So while riparian areas are managed often as private land or by, you know, like the San Pedro Conservation Area, upland areas are typically in the Forest Service or the Park Service. A lot of them are heavily grazed, or there's mining threats, specifically in the Patagonia Mountains or the Santa Rita Mountains. So it kind of creates a whole new set of challenges for recovering this species. And then on the recorders and acoustic monitoring, our preliminary results have definitely shown that recorders are effective in identifying occupied habitat. So that's some pretty exciting stuff. They're a really useful and versatile tool. So, you know, in addition to monitoring cuckoos, you can use these to monitor any species that creates sound at all, especially species that create loud sounds so that can be heard from far away. So if you imagine, maybe you want to listen for jaguars, if they, you know, they call very infrequently, but they do call and they call loud. You can use them to monitor jaguars potentially, or Montezuma quail, or any other species you might be looking for. And then there's, you know, there's advantages and limitations to recorders as well. So of course you can't see anything with these recorders, but so you can't always know where the birds were specifically. You kind of have to estimate that they're in the area. So there's some limitations there. In addition to also having to, you know, change out the batteries and the memory cards and purchasing them in the first place. But some of the advantages, like I've been saying, you have this permanent data set that you can go back to. And so I've got, you know, 10 terabytes of acoustic data, and I'm only looking for cuckoos in that data, but there might be other biologists who are interested in looking at that data for other species of interest too. And since I have that data in raw form ready to go, I can just transfer it to somebody else and they can just mine that data for whatever it is they're looking for as well. So really cool stuff there. And then finally, here's a picture of Smith Canyon and a huge team of volunteers that we trained up in the wildlife corridor property. So for me, you know, I just think of Patagonia generally as being just an amazing natural classroom and laboratory and community to work in. You know, this place, including the Patagonia Sonoyta Creek Preserve that TNC owns, and the Patton Center for Hummingbirds and the Borderlands Wildlife Preserve, it's just this wonderful network of laboratories to do research in, to do education, to do restoration. It's just so wonderful to work there. It's so accessible. Patagonia itself is a wonderful town to visit and be a part of the community. So yeah, just broadly speaking, it's just an amazing place to work. And again, like I said earlier in the talk, I really couldn't have done any of this work without a huge network of collaborators, including Borderlands, including Tucson Audubon and Audubon, Arizona, and the funding we've received from the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service, and the contributions from the Park Service and all these other collaborators. So it's just been an amazing time working with all of these collaborators and getting to know these folks generally. And so with that, I'll just let y'all know my email address in case you have any specific questions or inquiries. We do plan on doing more field work next summer. And so if any of you are in the area and want to help volunteer, you can get in touch with me and I'll give you some more info. And so with that, I'll wrap it up now and hand it back over to Luke.
Thanks, Nick. Hey, really appreciate you and Audrey and Choya sharing your expertise and all the fun things that you guys are doing down there along the Sonoyta Creek. And we do have a couple questions. I know we're pretty far over time, but just a couple of things I wanted to hit on with all of you. One was, is there a map of the Borderlands Wildlife Preserve, and how would you get there and go and visit it?
Yeah, so we do have a map, and I can actually provide that as well as the Borderlands Wildlife Preserve brochure to you, Luke, if you wanted to send it out to the participants afterwards.
That would be fabulous.
Okay, great. And when I do send that out, I'll send out some directions as well. But essentially, it's just if you're driving to Patagonia from Sonoyta, maybe 300 yards off after mile marker 23, there's a sign on your right-hand side, big brown metal sign in blue letters that says Wildlife Corridors, and that's where you turn in to go.
Great. Yeah, and we should try to get it designated as an eBird hotspot too. I tried to look up on eBird to see if it was there, but right now it's not. So we should work on making it a hotspot. That'd be great.
Awesome.
But yeah, Audrey, I'll be sending out an email to everyone later this afternoon. I do apologize. For some reason, I was kicked out in the middle of the presentation, and the host duties went to someone else. I don't know who it went to, but evidently it worked out okay. So the recording I have is cut up in 2 different sections. I'm just glad everything went well. So I'll send out the links to those 2 of those recordings later, along with those directions that that Audrey will share with me. One question that I thought was maybe you could answer as well, Audrey, is how often do those rock structures that you set up for erosion control, how often do those get washed out?
They don't get washed out very frequently. Typically what we'll see is after maybe 2 to 3 years that you can go back and do some maintenance on them, where maybe like one rock will roll down the stream bed a bit.
Cool. Well, that's good to know. Let's see. I'll include Nick and Audrey and Choya and Howard's email in the follow-up email. So if any of you have any other questions for them, feel free to respond to them through their email addresses, or if you're interested in volunteering or learning more about Borderlands restoration, reach out to them and they'll be happy to help you out. So thank you to everyone for joining, and go ahead, and if you want, you can take yourself off of mute. Thank you to all of our presenters. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting.
All right. Well, we'll see you again soon, and take care.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.